happy to be here. So thanks to Theo and Liam for putting this together, and excited always when I talk like this. It's in hope of continuing interactions and engagement. That's what Prosocial World is all about. And so now, without further ado, let me share my screen here. Okay, so what is individualism? It is the claim that all things social can be understood in terms of the motives and actions of individuals. I love social history, and this one has long historical roots, so I'd love to discuss that with you. But it's been the dominant intellectual tradition for the last 70 years, all aspects of our culture. In economics, it manifests as good old Homo economicus. In the social sciences, is methodological individualism. And as Liam was noting, in my own field of evolutionary science, this manifested during the 1960s as the theory of individual selection and selfish genes, famously popularized by Richard Dawkins. And it's so interesting to think of all of these together, and also just as part of something much broader, which manifests in popular culture, as Ein Land's Atlas Shrugged, Margaret Thatcher's famous statement about there being no such thing as society, and immortalized by Gordon Gekko in Wall Street with the three-word phrase, greed is good. So this is the proverbial water that the fish have difficulty seeing. It's so pervasive in our culture. Well, what preceded individualism? It was the concept of society as an organism in its own right. Of course, there's individuals, but they play their appointed roles in the context of a larger whole. This too has deep intellectual roots, all the way back to antiquity, and has religious expression, the body of the church united under the head of Christ. It has political manifestations, Hobbes' Leviathan, and the fathers of sociology and social psychology, such as Emil Durkheim. This was such a common view, the idea of society as an organism in its own right, that according to the psychologist Daniel Wegner, almost every early social theorist we now recognize as a contributor to modern social psychology held a similar view. And so the concept of society as an organism is not at all new. What is new, as I will show, is for it to have a new scientific foundation. Well, the problem with both of these traditions is that they're axiomatic. They're both axiomatic about the unit of functional organization, groups in one case, individuals in the other. And what we need is a theory that's capable of determining the presence or absence of functional organization. Not everything is functionally organized, and the units of functional organization, and to be able to do this on a case-by-case basis. Maybe it's an individual, maybe it's a group, maybe it's neither. And that is what multi-level selection theory does, with profound applications for human cultural evolution, and therefore policy, everything we try to do in order to improve things, in addition to genetic evolution. That's what I'm happy to introduce you to today. So let's begin with just some clear thinking about functional organization, which we could actually state even without any reference to evolution. So here's two complex objects. One's a snowflake, the other is an organism, a fruit fly, and they both have lots of structure. In the case of a snowflake, because it has no function, it's not designed to do anything, the only way that we can analyze it is in purely physical terms, in the process of ice crystallization. In contrast, the fruit fly is functionally organized, designed, in this case by natural selection, to survive and reproduce in its environment. And the fact that it's functionally organized permits a kind of analysis which is only available to living systems, and their physical artifacts. And this is, in the case of a fruit fly, the fruit fly is functionally organized, designed, in this case by natural selection, to survive and reproduce in its environment. And the fact that it's functionally organized permits a kind of analysis which is only available to living systems and their physical artifacts. And not at all new for you. It's deeply intuitive that when we're faced with something like an organism or a human implement, then it becomes, the whole unit becomes a kind of an anchor of analysis. Everything below the level of the organism in this case is analyzed in terms of its contribution to the functioning of the whole, its organs, its cells, its molecules. And everything above the level of the organism is analyzed in terms of populations of agents following their respective adaptive strategies. That's a bit of a mouthful, but it leads to a very important distinction in complex system terms between a complex system that's adaptive as a system, that's a fruit fly, we'll call that complex systems 1, and a complex system composed of agents following their respective adaptive strategies. That's the second meaning of complex adaptive systems. And so a fruit fly is a CAS1. That means that everything below it can be analyzed in terms of its contribution to the function of the whole. But fruit fly populations or fruit flies as members of a multi-species ecosystem, those are complex system composed of agents following their respective adaptive strategies. And the most important point that needs to be made is that CAS2 systems do not robustly organize into CAS1 systems. There's no process of self-organization that causes populations and ecosystems to turn into organisms. Special conditions are required for any evolutionary process, including cultural evolution. And so this is kind of a hard lesson to learn about nature, but although it's the fundamental import of Darwin's theory of evolution, is that it leads to order at some scale, such as a single organism, but then that turns into disorder at higher scale. So here's some biological examples. So natural selection causes fruit flies to have high reproductive rates. Well, guess what? That can result in chaotic population dynamics. In many species, organisms evolved to kill the babies of others so that they could have their own babies, infanticide. That's good for the infanticidal individual, bad for the population, bad for the species. In migratory bird species, often females suffer higher mortality because males, being larger, claim the best habitats during migration in the wintering grounds. Good for the males, bad for the species. If you take whole ecosystems, such as beaver ecosystems, can be understood primarily as collateral effects of beavers maximizing their own fitness. Nothing's being maximized at the ecosystem level here, not biodiversity, not nutrient cycling, nothing. This is basically one species engineering the ecosystem for itself. And so ecologists are increasingly using the word regime to describe stable assemblages of species in nature. And I love that word because we already have a rich intuition about it with respect to human political regimes. We know for the human case that to call something a regime implies a degree of stability, but says nothing about whether the regime functions well for the common good. Human political regimes vary widely, from highly inclusive to highly extractive. And books such as Why Nations Fail by Asimoglu and Robinson tell that story well. And so what we know as biologists is that ecological regimes are no different. The idea that nature left to itself strikes some kind of harmonious balance, it's just no more true for nature than it is for economies. So for something to become an organism, that requires a process of selection at the level of that unit. We can say this in systems engineering terms. Any systems engineer will tell you that a complex system cannot be optimized by separately optimizing its parts. So this is very general. So the reason that this is not a justification of individualism, because so far I've been describing it in the context of an organism such as a fruit fly, is that units of functional organization in nature can include, but are not restricted to individual organisms. And so if we were to study social insect colonies, then the whole colony would be the unit of selection. And now the individual would become something like an organ or like a cell of the colony, in addition to being functionally organized in some respects as its own unit. The phenomenon of cancer is nothing more or less than natural selection taking place within multicellular organisms. And so cancers proliferate at the expense of the cooperative cells of the body. That's adaptive in the evolutionary sense of the term. The cancer becomes a kind of organism in its own right, and the organism becomes a kind of an environment of the cancer. Microbiomes are a case of whole ecosystems that can become functionally organized because they're selected along with the genes of the organisms. When organisms differentially survive and reproduce, their microbiomes are being selected in addition to their genes. And we're only beginning to understand the degree to which we, all multicellular organisms, are in fact a symbiosis with trillions of microbes that have been selected along with our genes. And so now we're coming to a point where we can identify units of functional organization on a case-by-case basis, which might be individuals, might be groups, or might be neither. So functional analysis must be anchored in the units of selection. Units of selection must be determined on a case-by-case basis. And if you know something about evolution, you know that no unit, no biological unit is entirely functional. And so we must be able to identify such things as byproducts, examples of drift, differences that have no effect on survival and reproduction, traits that are parts of larger developmental system, the concept of evolutionary mismatches, organisms that are adapted to past environments, but not their present environments. So this is all part of what it means to take a fully rounded evolutionary approach to the study of not just of genetic evolution, but of cultural evolution. And my book, This View of Life, covers all of this ground for a general audience. Because of our time together is so short, I just have to mention these major developments. So major evolutionary transitions is the idea that everything we call an organism is in fact a highly regulated society of lower level units that have become sufficiently well regulated so that they can function as organisms. This concept is now making sense of human evolution, and what distinguishes our species from other primate species is that we have become so highly cooperative at the scale of small groups by genetic evolution. The very phenomenon of culture, especially the capacity for symbolic thought as a form of mental cooperation, and this leading to a second track of inheritance. This is called dual inheritance theory. Cultural evolution is a multi-level process, just like genetic evolution, leading to increasing scales of functional organization over the course of human history. This is Turchin's work. And then finally, all of this, in addition to providing a panoramic view of life and human life, serving as a practical toolkit for managing cultural evolution in real world settings. And this, I'll be very interested to know in the Q&A in tomorrow's session, how familiar you are with this. In my experience, I deal with people that are so well read, so progressive, so open-minded, really complex systems of thinking. They're, of course, very familiar with tech, but this stuff is, for the most part, very new to them. And so much of what we need to know is explicitly evolutionary. General complex systems theory will not get you there, although it's, of course, a very important part of it. It's this explicitly evolutionary material which is needed and which has only been developed over the last 20 or 30 years, therefore little known, even among people that are just completely open-minded about it. It's a matter of encountering it, not being resistant to it in my experience. And so for applying this to the real world, this can be done in many ways. One point to make is that this becomes inherently transdisciplinary. So the same basic developments can be applied to disciplines, topic areas as different as clinical psychology in my article with Jim Cohen, and economics in my article, forthcoming article with Dennis Snower. Each of these fields has been highly individualistic in different ways. Of course, we have the rational actor model in economics, but in clinical psychology, it goes without saying that the individual is the unit of that you work with. 99% of clinical psychologists work only with individuals, at most with couples or families. And so the idea that we could work with groups at multiple levels and that we need to is very new within the field of clinical psychology. So let me just spend a little time introducing you to Jim Cohen's work on something that he calls social baseline theory, which notes very simply that individuals, humans, never lived alone during our entire history as a species. We always lived in the context of highly cooperative groups, even when those groups were warring with other groups. And because that was arguably the one constant of human genetic evolution, our brains and bodies evolved in this context to seamlessly integrate personal and social resources when making its trade-off decisions. And so we are more like ants in colonies, ants that need to be in colonies, than most people have ever imagined. So if you remove an individual from a nurturing cooperative group setting, it really is like separating an ant from her colony. And a wonderful experiment that Jim cites from his colleague Dennis Prophet, I think, illustrates this. So imagine I take you to the base of a tall hill like this, and I ask you to estimate its slope, so you do. And then I do that under conditions in which I deplete your personal resources, either before or after fasting, before or after a workshop, with or without a heavy backpack. And so if I deplete your personal resources, you're less likely to want to climb the hill. But what's curious is that you actually perceive the hill as steeper. You estimate its slope as higher when I deplete your personal resources. That's just how we are constructed. So against that background, we had a fourth condition. We had a social resource, you alone versus you next to a friend. And dang, when I don't place a friend next to you, the slope of that hill goes down. Let's climb that hill, you say. So what's happened here? Without knowing it, completely subconsciously, your brain has factored in the social resources in just the same way as it factored in your personal resources on the decision of climbing the hill. That's the degree to which we seamlessly integrate the two. And so there's been a kind of a revival of group level thinking and social psychology. Here's another paper by Gary Steinberg, Shared Worlds and Shared Minds, a theory of collective learning and psychology of common knowledge, which is part of these developments. Now, against this background, Elinor Ostrom looms large. I'm guessing that Elinor Ostrom is pretty well known in this group, but I'm betting also not entirely known. I think this illustrates part of the problem of what I call the archipelago problem, many islands of thought with little communication among islands. And this is one of the problems that an evolutionary perspective solves. She was a political scientist by training. She studied the famous tragedy of the commons, the overexploitation of common pool resources. What she showed by studying real common pool resource groups around the world is that contrary to economic wisdom, some groups, not all of them, but some groups were capable of self-managing their resources without privatizing them or requiring top-down management, but only if they possess certain core design principles. And for this achievement, she won the Nobel Prize in Economics in 2009. And so what are these core design principles? Here they are. And so very quickly, these are the groups that were able to avoid the tragedy of the commons. First and foremost, they had a strong group identity, sense of purpose. They knew that they were a group. They knew what it was about. They knew who was a member. They knew, in this case, the boundaries of their resources. There was a fair distribution of costs and benefits, not sustainable for some members of the group to get the benefits and for others to do the work. There must be some sense in which what a member gets from the group is proportional to what they give to the group. There must be fair and inclusive decision-making, not sustainable for some members to call the shots and others not to have a stake in their own decisions. Not only is that a recipe for unfairness, but it also doesn't make use of the wisdom of the members of the group. Agreed upon behaviors need to be monitored. If we don't know, then of course all bets are off. If we're not doing what we should, something must be done about it, but it need not start out harsh. It can start out friendly and then only escalate when necessary. And let there be abundant praise for good behaviors in addition to mild sanctions against bad behaviors that escalate as needed. Conflicts will occur. They need to be resolved in a manner that's fast and fair. The group has to have the elbow room to manage their own affairs. If they can't, if they're being bossed from without, then of course all bets are off. And then finally, these core design principles are scale independent. They're needed for interactions among groups in addition to interactions within groups. So that's tremendously important, is that these core design principles apply to all scales of a multi-level hierarchy. So I was privileged to work with Lynn for 3 years before her death in 2012. And what we did together was we generalized these core design principles from an evolutionary perspective. And I hope that you can see, just on the basis of my brief introduction, that these core design principles basically accomplish a major evolutionary transition for the group. If you imagine an individual trying to disrupt the group for self-serving purposes, it would be very difficult if these core design principles are in place. If they're not, then of course that's easy pickings for disruptive self-serving behaviors. And so this leads to a bold prediction, which is that what Ostrom showed for one type of group should hold for all types of groups. The common denominator is the need to cooperate and coordinate. So no matter what type of group we study, first we should find variation from high to low. And secondly, this variation should be explained by variation in the implementation of the core design principles. Here's one study that tests that hypothesis. It's a survey study in which we ask people to bring two groups to mind. One, a business group, a place of employment, and another, any other group of their choice. So it's a comparison of business groups with any other type of groups. And then they provided information on how well the group implemented the core design principles and how well the group functioned as a cooperative unit. And the results are very simply a very strong correlation between implementation of the core design principles and group functioning for trust, satisfaction, satisfaction of needs, cooperation, and commitment, only minor interaction effects. So basically, this supports the hypothesis that all groups need the core design principles. Business groups, no less than other kinds of groups. And the second major is that on average, business groups were deficient in all 8 of the core design principles, every single one of them, with the largest deficits being autonomy to self-govern. In other words, many people in their jobs can't do their jobs as they see fit. Sense of identity and purpose. Many people in their jobs don't find a sense of meaning. And decision-making. Many people in their jobs don't take part in the decisions that influence them in their work. So all 8, and these are average deficits. So that means that business groups vary too, just like other kinds of groups. And some business groups function very well thanks to implementing the core design principles. So these are only average. And some non-business groups function terribly. So it's only an average difference. So why is it that we get this average deficit? I think in large parts because of the underlying world view. And the form of individualism that's associated with Milton Friedman, the so-called shareholder value model, that the only responsibility of a business is to maximize profits for its shareholders. If that's the way you see the world, then that's how you're going to run your business, and that's going to result in deficit. So there's a world of difference between, as Einstein put it, the theory decides what can be seen, the way we think about businesses and what we do in those businesses. So that brings us back to dual inheritance theory, the idea that there's actually 2 streams of inheritance in our species. Every one of you is a collection of genes. We call that your genotype. That influences just about everything we could measure about you. We call that your phenotype. And each one of you is also a collection of interrelated symbols. Let's call it your type to stress the comparison. And those symbols also influence just about everything that could be measured about you. So the very same phenotype. And so the idea of thinking of our symbolic systems as literally like our genes that need to be changed if there's going to be substantial phenotypic change highlights, it's not new, other people already get this, the need for interchange in order to accomplish outer change. This brings a new kind of a clarity and I think scientific methodology to how we go about changing our symbotypes in order to change our phenotypes, how we act in the world. And so to finish up this talk, I want to just briefly reflect on how when we think at the symbotypic level, this results in a convergence of science, economics, and spirituality. And when we think of the phenotypic level, this leads to what we call a field site approach for stewarding multi-level selection in real world settings. So I've mentioned that I'm working on the economic front with Dennis Snower on others to basically place economics on an authentic scientific foundation for the first time, since the scientific foundation of neoclassical economics is really not scientifically justifiable at all. And then putting this to work at multiple scales, beginning with small groups, all the way up to the planet. But the fact that there's multiple levels is essential. We can't work either at any given single level, certainly not just at the planetary scale, certainly not just at the scale of small groups. So here's where multi-level selection theory becomes vitally important. And at the very same time, I'm working with spiritual leaders, such as I had a wonderful opportunity for a 1-hour conversation with His Holiness, and more recently working with folks at Plum Village, which is the community founded by Thich Nhat Hanh, and it's thanks to Liam, who was at a college, that I'm here talking with you folks today. So here we have what seems to be completely different worlds: the world of economics in the world of spirituality, but definitely traveling along parallel tracks. And of course, we have a spiritual version of environmentalism, including the Norwegian environmentalist and philosopher. Now we have the concept of Gaia, of course, the whole Earth as a organism. There's a whole tradition of evolutionary spirituality, heard by Teilhard de Chardin, and his wonderful quote about for the second time in the history of the world, humanity will have discovered fire, a whole community of people who call themselves evolutionary leaders. And this led to what's sometimes called interspirituality. That term was coined by Brother Wayne Teasdale, who was a mentor of Jeff Janung, my partner, who is present at this meeting. And what interspirituality means is that religious, spiritual, and scientific worldviews converge upon a common awareness of rich interconnectedness. The idea of rich interconnectedness is something that we can converge upon from many different directions. And as Teilhard put it, all things that rise must converge. And this awareness leads to an ethical conclusion, namely the futility of one part of the system attacking another part of the system. I think that's the meaning of Buddhism's Four Noble Truths, among other things. And this common awareness and its ethical conclusion allows religious, spiritual, and scientific worldviews to mingle with each other. This is sometimes called second-tier consciousness, without losing their own value as separate traditions. And so in this fashion, I see a merging of scientific and more or less secular worldviews with spiritual worldviews from a evolutionary perspective. Now, finally, the field site concept comes naturally to an evolutionary biologist such as myself. Here I am as a graduate student in 1976. At that time, I was studying insects, and it goes without saying when you're an evolutionary biologist that the study of any species must be based on understanding that species in the context of its natural environment. There are some human-oriented disciplines that are like this, cultural anthropology and sociology, and also community-based participatory action research have also converged upon the importance of working basically with people in the context of their everyday lives. This is very much a matter of being done with, not being done to. And so what we are doing at Prosocial World basically is we're in a very ambitious way. We are attempting to create field sites around the world, all scales, all topic areas. That's part of the generality of evolutionary theory. And so a field site begins with some existing sociocultural system. I should have said sociocultural environmental system, which we've chosen to become a target of selection. Some set of partners within the system that has at least some capacity to influence it, large or small. Minimally, we'll have a bottom-up capacity of working at the scale of small groups. Everyone has that capacity. Optimally, this will be with the help of what we call enlightened top-down organizations. Top-down is not command and control, not centralized planning. It means helping to orchestrate cultural evolution at lower scales and participating in cultural evolution at higher scales. And there's a lot of organizations that get that. I'm sure some of the organizations that have been gathered here, of course, get that very deeply. It's a matter of how to act upon it. And so what we're trying to do in Prosocial World is to create a worldwide community, first of scientists, to study and track this as it is taking place. In the conversation that preceded my talk with Liam and Theo, I had talked about turning an archipelago into an inheritance system, we could expand upon that if we wanted the Q&A. A worldwide community of facilitators to work with groups. And so far we've trained over 600 from over 30 nations. And of course, a worldwide community of field sites with continuous engagement in mind. And so we have online trainings on a regular basis. The 24th of them is going to begin on October 11th, 10th through the 13th, depending upon your geographical zone. And so one concrete step would be to basically take this online training and to learn a lot more about this practical stewarding of cultural evolution that we are developing. And so I think I have left exactly 20 minutes for Q&A, which is what I intended. So thank you everyone for your attention. And I look forward to now an open-ended Q&A.
Thank you so much, David. That was a fascinating talk, and I think really heartening to see some religious scientific underpinnings for stuff that I think a lot of us are very intuitively feeling. So just a quick reminder, we'll be touching on some of the concepts that David has mentioned here in our talk tomorrow, which is going to be a lot more of a participatory imaginaries-based session with our partner Phoebe from Moral Imaginations, who is on the call. So hope to see you at that. But in the meantime, if you've got any questions or comments for David, then please either raise your hand in Zoom or sort of pop them in the chat and I can come to you. So I see Phoebe's hand has gone up, please.
I thought I would just kick us off while other people are thinking about their questions. Hi, David, it's great to meet you. I've followed and loved your work for many years, actually, since I was an undergrad in biology. And so it's just, yeah, fantastic to hear you speak about all of this and see how much it's bridging with the social systems, kind of bridging the biology with the kind of ways that we need to organize given the state of the planet. And I guess this question will also connect to tomorrow's session a little bit. As someone who started in science and then became very interested in governance and organizing, I've reached this place of really believing that we have to find ways to help people get a felt sense of the sorts of things that you're talking about, that we are not individuals, that the smallest unit of society is the group, and things like symbiosis, the fact that we're made up of kind of 9/10 bacteria. These are all facts that I learned and kind of explored as a scientist, but noticed that people found it very difficult to take that on as an actual kind of worldview or a feeling. And now I'm exploring and interested in how can we work with artists and these imagination methods to bring that alive. And I was just curious about whether you have explored that yourself, what you think about using perhaps more affective approaches to bring this stuff alive. And yeah, if you've got any thoughts on that, I'd be really curious.
Yeah, lots, Phoebe, and I'm glad Jeff is on the call, because Jeff is one of the central members of Prosocial World, and also has created a website called contemplativelife.org, which is basically an inventory of contemplative practices. And Brother Wayne Teasdale was a mentor of Jeff, but Jeff talks all the time, we do now, of basically 4 supports for this. There's science, there's technology, but then there's spirituality and the arts, which speaks to your point. And that's more the felt experience. When it comes to spirituality, I think one of the things that we can say is that the whole concept of spirituality, of being part of joyfully being part of something larger than yourself, is deeply ingrained in human psychology. Jonathan Haidt makes this. And so it's something that can be triggered and fostered. And there's a whole experiential component, what we would call a heartfelt component, not just an intellectual component that comes with practice and meditation and these things that we associate with spirituality. And we have a whole branch of prosocial called Prosocial Spirituality that basically coaches people in spiritual principles, in addition to these core design principles. But it's also something that happens naturally, you might say, that whenever groups of people get together and they really focus on their common concerns and so on and so forth, and especially if the work is meaningful and challenging, then this is a shift that takes place quite naturally, and can be. With respect to the arts, this is something we're only starting to do. We recognize its importance, but just very recently, we're preparing a grant proposal to do exactly that. And what that will be basically engaging with artists to introduce them to all of this. Imagine an extended version of what we just did, delivered to creatives, and then more or less standing back and facilitating the creation of their arts. It might be music or stories or videos, anything. And then basically communicating to the arts, facilitating that. So I'd love to partner with people on that, Phoebe. So yeah, absolutely.
Thank you.
Corinne, I think, is the next.
Yes. First of all, thank you, David, for this enlightening presentation. Like it's music to my ears. I actually work with business groups. I have a consulting agency specialized in regenerative transformations. So I tackle those topics from a business perspective and how those groups can come to the realization that they have to change the rules of the game that Milton Friedman established in the 70s. I wanted to go back to the core design principles for the efficacy of groups. And as part of the findings of this study, I was wondering, what about leadership? Like, how does it play, and if it has a role or not, how does it play in the efficacy of the group? Are there any specific traits in individuals that would be recognized as huge drivers for change for that group to kind of like carry on with this self-organizing setup? Yeah,
Corinne, thanks very much for that. It's notable that the core design principles per se say nothing about leadership, and if anything, they seem to imply that there shouldn't be leaders because so much is based on equity and so on. But for any group, other than the very smallest of groups, there does have to be some structure, and so there does have to be a type of leadership, which is more of, I mean, the word steward rather than leader would probably be the best word for that. So to steward something means that you do play some coordinating role, but it's not top down. It's not, I mean, there's not a power imbalance basically. And so there's words for this. It's like steward, leader, and so on. And there's, lots of business models. When we talk about the idea of an archipelago of many islands of thought and practice, and if you look at the business world, I mean, there's many examples of this kind of governance. And yeah, I'm sure the people who are familiar with them, teal organizations, Ledoux, and the concept of teal organization, conscious capitalism, B Corps. There's an amazing book I just read by a guy named Bob Chapman called, what is it called? I mean, what he's done is, in like almost 100 cases, he's acquired companies and he's ailing companies, and he's brought them back to health, not by changing personnel, but by changing culture, by changing their culture. And that culture is genuinely put people first. I mean, genuinely put people first. So this is something which works in business. And there's so much evidence for it, in fact, that you scarcely need to do any more research on it. But the whole thing has been eclipsed and concealed by this worldview. So there's so much to do and so much to point to, basically, within the business literature, that it is a matter of kind of seeing it from the right perspective and going on from there.
Thank you.
Theo.
Yeah, I thought I would jump in myself. I wonder if you could speak a little to the implications of your work and the work of Prosocial World more broadly, for the kind of the realities of the power dynamics that we see in our current society. I mean, all of this, it really, really enthuses me to hear these theoretical foundations, but we exist in societies that are somewhat captured by powerful interests that perhaps have kind of self-serving incentive structures that deviate very much from their the incentives for the wider organism. You know, you touch on the example of cancer cells in the body, and it's kind of like, how do we wake the cancer cells up to the reality that they're destroying their host, and particularly in a case where the host may only die long after the cancer cells themselves have ceased to exist.
Well, question, I think, is that there's variation at all scales, including the larger scales. The largest scale is planetary, but the next down from that is the national scale. And what we find is, just like with businesses, we find variation, and the best nations, and that includes the Nordic nations, the famous Nordic model, have actually managed to curtail power at least more than other nations. And it's always a struggle. It's always a struggle. Did you know it's a struggle for multicellular organisms? I mean, the reason that cancer is as infrequent as it is because of elaborate mechanisms that prevent cancer that evolved by many millions of years of evolution. The same is true with cultures. Cultures resist social cancers by being well protected against them. And those defenses, basically moral systems, are the basis of those. The very concept of morality is like an immune system against cancerous social behaviors. And that kind of moral system can be implemented at any scale, including the national scale, and is impressively at the nations that function best. And so if you've read Why Nations Fail or Peter Turchin's work, you know that the best functioning societies are the inclusive ones. And the reason that they're inclusive is because they have protections against that sort of thing. I've studied Norway for a long, long time, and I've learned that, back to business, that in Norway, if a CEO makes more than like 17 times the salary of the average employee, that's just thought to be wrong. So the idea of making 500 times this, just no, you can't do that. And the whole governance is one in which labor is strong, capital is strong, and the government is strong, and they work collaboratively. So there's that basically sharing of power. So I think the 2 points, just to keep it short, is that so much depends on the worldview. I mean, the idea of the worldview that says that trickle-down economics is just fine, and the neoclassical model is just fine as a model of globalization, you'll get what you ask for. If the worldview becomes this, then it just reorients what's considered right and wrong in social policy. And then once we see it that way, then there's no lack of good examples at all scales. It's not new. It's so the reorientation, coupled with the kind of protections that we all are familiar with, is I think makes it very plausible that the shift in perspective could actually result in the actual phenotypic effects, to speak in evolutionary terms. Let's see, Megan.
Hi, my question is sort of building off of what you were talking about with the relationship of the genotype, the symbotype, and the phenotype. And I'm just curious because I've been, through my own research, I've been sort of looking at some of these ideas of semiotic readings of the natural world and the relationships between the natural world. I'm particularly Eduardo Cohn's writing, Thinking Like a Forest. I'm just curious how, if any of that sort of thinking has come into play with any of these economic theories. And yeah, just out of curiosity.
Yeah, that's what's Thinking Like a Forest. I'm this familiar with it, not this familiar with it. So
Yeah.
you might know more than I do. But it's a genuine possibility, and one of the, I think, the subtle things that needs to be cultivated, both for the study of the natural world and for the human world, is the possibility of both presence and absence of functional organization. We have to be able to identify functional organization where it does and does not exist. And what that means, if you contemplate something like a forest, then it could be not functionally organized. It could be that CAS2 system that I talked about, merely a bunch of species pursuing their separate adaptive strategies and therefore imposing suffering on each other. When the Buddha said life is suffering, suffering is caused by craving and desire, he was describing the natural world in addition to the human world. On the other hand, we make an exception for microbiomes, basically the diverse communities that are part of our bodies. Could forests be like that? Could forests be like a microbiome? Might we have vastly underestimated the degree of mutualism that takes place? A forest is spatially large compared to us, but as a biological unit, it's not larger than our microbiomes. Our microbiomes are already as large as they can be. Trillions of individuals, thousands of species. They're functionally organized to an impressive degree. Might a forest, might selection have actually taken place at that scale, and so that concept of thinking like a forest might be true? Well, we actually don't know. We don't know, and so that's where you have to find out. You have to do the determination. So I think. Please continue.
I think one of the things that's kind of interesting is that as you're talking about the balance systems and the CAS1 versus CAS2, it reminds me of what happens when you have a more intact ecosystem, a CAS1 forest that does balance itself, versus a system where humans have intervened, whether that be, say, in the United States, the entire Northeast, almost all of it was clear cut at some point. So we have these very fragmentary, disturbed forests that I think function more as CAS2, but they can be pushed back to CAS1 through positive interaction or forestry that is meant to sort of foster the ecological balance. So I think just a thought as you were talking, that there is something that I think they can exist in both ways. It just sort of depends on how we've intervened and the nature of that intervention within them.
Yeah, part of I guess we have just 2 more minutes, but hopefully this will all lead to further conversations, including tomorrow. I do feel impelled to make the point that, I mean, disturbance is one thing, and disturbance, of course, is very disturbing. I mean, so what you said about disturbance is true. At the same time, in the absence of disturbance, in the absence of human disturbance, the point still needs to be made that nature left to itself, it's laissez-faire. Nature is no more likely to lead to, the invisible hand doesn't work in nature any more than it works in economic systems. So even in untouched natural systems, think of it as maybe like a laissez-faire economy in the way that we're accustomed to thinking about that with humans. But then with the point of what we do moving forward, then we get into regenerative agriculture and a bioregional approach and wonderful, wonderful stuff that we have some projects and we want more. One of my most recent talks was to R 3.0, and I'll bet some people on this call are familiar with R 3.0 as a consortium of organizations that are into basically regenerative culture. That includes regenerative agriculture with biodiversity in mind, and much else. So at the end of the day, this does require becoming basically stewards of the whole earth, an essential thing to do.
Thank you so much, David. Well, as we are now on time, I just once again like to really offer my thanks to David, to Jeff, and our colleagues at Prosocial World for a really, really fascinating session. All of you for joining us here today and the great questions. So once again, tomorrow we will be going through in sort of a collective imaginary process around what mental health care might look like at the level of the social organism, rather than sort of being an individualized process. So if you'd like to come along for that, it's going to be amazing. So, you know, please hope to see you there and enjoy the rest of the festival. Thanks all.
Thanks, everyone. Thank you.
Thank you.